I'm Hallie, and just when you thought it couldn't get any more excruciating for the people of Uvalde after the massacre of those 19 children and 2 teachers at Robb Elementary School, there's that acknowledgement coming today from police that the wrong decision was made not to go into that classroom. Massive failures on the part of police on the scene. Gut-wrenching new details about the timeline and what happened that horrific day. It's coming as the Texas governor, you might have watched it live just now on NBC News Now, right as we were coming on the air, laid out how the state plans to help this devastated community. Things like mental health resources, helped by anonymous donors so no family has to bear the cost of this. Now, Governor Abbott is skipping an appearance at the NRA Convention in Houston. That's happening right now, actually, right around the same time. Although he still did send over some taped comments there. He did not mention any gun reform proposals. He did not bring up in that news conference those failures by police. But this announcement is coming just hours after the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety, Stephen McCraw, says police did not make the right decision not to go into that classroom, not to bust down the doors of that room and get inside and help those kids. McCraw says the on-site commander, the person who was in charge at the scene, thought it was not an active shooter situation, but instead a so-called barricade or hostage situation. Listen.
Hey, from the benefit of hindsight, where I'm sitting now, of course it was not the right decision. It was the wrong decision, period. There's no excuse for that. But again, I wasn't there, but I'm just telling you, from what we know, we believe there should have been an entry at that as soon as you can.
Did you hear that? No excuse, he says. So here, look at this. Look at whatever screen you're looking on. This is the new timeline of events, at least as of right now, based on what we heard from him, according to 911 calls, video from the scene, etc. Critically, that there were still people alive, still kids alive in that room when officers were outside. So 11:28 is when the gunman starts firing at witnesses outside the school after he crashes his car. Right before then, the school door had been propped open by a teacher. Right after this crash, within the next couple minutes, somebody calls 911, a teacher at the school. The gunman then starts shooting at the school. A school safety officer heard that 911 call, shows up, drives right past the suspect inadvertently, who at 11:33 a.m. then enters the school through that open door, starts firing the first of more than 100 rounds. 2 minutes later, you have 7 officers who get to the scene. 2 of them were grazed by gunshots, grazed by bullets. And by 11:51 a.m., up to 19 officers are in the hallway. Remember that. 10 to noon, 19 officers in the hall. At 12:03, we start to hear about 911 calls from inside room 112, where the shooter is. At 12:10, there's a call where somebody, a student, a kid, says multiple people have been killed. Remember, McCraw said the on-site commander didn't think anyone inside was in danger, even though at 12:16, there was a 911 call that said 8 to 9 students were still alive. That call came right around the time that the U.S. Border Patrol tactical team arrived. A couple minutes later, there's another 911 call, 12:19, from a different room. And then 2 minutes after that, the gunman fires at the door. By 12:43, this caller, another caller, maybe a 4th grader, is asking 911 to please send police now. That is a gutting detail. A kid in the room begging police to help. At 12:50, they finally do get into the classroom. They used keys they had to get from the janitor and shot the gunman. So if you're keeping track, that's an hour and 17 minutes from when the shooter got into the school to when police took him out. And to give you a sense of just the horror of this. All right, these are some pictures that we're getting in from Uvalde's newspaper. These are kids escaping. These are little kids escaping from Robb Elementary School. Something no kid should ever have to do. Before we get to more on the investigation and the timeline, we have the story of one more victim of this horrific massacre that we want to tell you about. We've learned more about her today. Her name is Maite Rodriguez. Her cousin says she dreamed about going to Texas A&M and becoming a marine biologist. She was just 10 years old. So now here, over the last 3 nights, we've been telling you about all these kids. We now know all their faces. We know all their names, all 19 of them. There they are. 2 of their teachers, heroes. One of them, who reportedly died with kids in her arms, killed in this attack by a man with an assault weapon who wanted to come in and kill kids. This is where we start tonight in America. Sam Brock is live in Uvalde. Shaft Brewster is in Houston. Pete Williams is in Washington. Morgan Chesky is actually in Uvalde for us. Morgan, let me go to you first because, you know, there's an interview on a different show that I do over on a different network with the brother of one of the little kids who was killed. Our colleague Yasmin Vasugian interviewed them and they said how angry they were about hearing these details. That in their view, police didn't do anything. Police didn't do near enough to try to save their little brother. I imagine that that is some of what you have heard as you've been on the ground here with these serious questions about why more action wasn't taken and what failures existed.
Yeah, Hallie, that's exactly what we're hearing right now. It doesn't take away from the fact that there are still 21 crosses behind me. And as angry and frustrated as people are getting who have heard this news, there are still questions that need answering. And we heard from investigators earlier today, Hallie, as they did share a play-by-play that was incredibly tragic in trying to lay out a more concrete timeline of what took place. And I think in doing so, they only created more frustration here because it now lets some of these people know in this community that there was a chance. There was 47 minutes, in fact, from 12:03 on Tuesday afternoon until 12:50. From the moment you had a group of about 19 officers inside the building until that door was breached with a custodian's key and that gunman was taken out at 12:50. The 47 minutes that transpired, during which 911 calls came in from students inside, during which there were still some brief exchanges of gunfire, those are going to be the 47 minutes that dwell in the minds of everyone that lives in this community going forward. There are specifics that still need to be learned, but right now, as this pile of flowers grows really by the minute here, so does the fact that people are realizing that closure, if they thought closure was a long way off, it may now be even farther with the fact that they know there was a potential opportunity to maybe save more lives here. Hallie?
You talked about the unanswered questions, Morgan, and I think it might be helpful to put some structure around that, right? Because here's what those questions are. Number one, why the school resource officer wasn't on the scene. Number two, at what point, if any, did those 19 officers who were in the hallway in that school, did any of them think maybe we need to go in sooner, right? There's the question about why, if the 911 operators knew kids were alive in that class at 12:16, why that was either not relayed or not acted upon by the law enforcement team on the ground. There is no timeline for when those answers may come.
Correct. And we shouted some of those questions at DPS whenever they had their press conference earlier today. They answered some, they did not answer others, and we hope that in the coming days there may be more clarity that comes from this. But again, Hallie, I should add, as much as we learn about this investigation, you do have a community that's still tasked with finding some sort of path forward here in moving on. And we know that funeral services are going to begin in the next coming days here for the 19 students, for those 2 teachers. We do know that there has been an incredible amount of donations in order to make sure that no family struggles to have to pay for any of these services. And I think most heartbreaking of all, we know that there is a funeral home in El Paso, Texas, who is shipping multiple caskets to this community for children. Hallie?
It is a detail that just wrecks you, Morgan. Considering these kids were supposed to be celebrating their first day of summer vacation today. And instead, their parents are planning their funerals. Morgan Chesky.
Absolutely.
I appreciate you being there on the ground. We'll look for more of your reporting tonight on Nightly. Thanks. Pete Williams, let me go to you here, NBC News Justice Correspondent. And our colleague Tom Winter got a copy of the 2020 Texas Active Shooter Training Guide. It says first responders to the active shooter scene will usually be required to place themselves in harm's way and display uncommon acts of courage to save the innocent, and that time is the #1 enemy. The issue appears to be here, Pete, one of several, is that the incident commander did not think it was an active shooter situation. They thought it was more of like a hostage situation. What are you hearing from law enforcement experts that you talk to in your network about this?
Well, I think that many of them, what they say is they understand that. I think apparently what was going through the mind of the on-scene commander was that we now know that Ramos fired his shots quickly after coming into the school, fired more than 100 rounds quickly. So the assumption was by then that most of the damage was done, and that the whole point was to try to keep it from becoming even worse. And apparently what the commander thought was, when we breach that door, we need to make sure that we can get in quickly and decisively and kill the gunman. And we can't do that in a haphazard way. We have to wait until we can get a key maybe or some other way to breach the door. I think one big question here, and what many of the law enforcement people I've talked to are saying, is why did it take so long for somebody to think, let's get a key to the door? If they thought of that immediately, why did it take so long to get the janitor to produce it? Why didn't the head of the school resource police have a key, a master key to any door in the school? So that's one question that comes up immediately. Another question that comes up is, did the on-scene commander know that there had been 911 calls from 2 of the young students who were in the room who survived the attack and were telling the police that there were still people, 8 or 9 of them, that survived the shooting and that they needed help immediately? Yeah. Did the on-scene commander get that word? They don't know that. So, you know, I think the feeling I've gotten from the police I've talked to is, yes, they understand why the commander didn't want to simply rush in. And, you know, many people have said they disregarded completely the lessons of Columbine. That's not entirely true, because in Columbine, the police all stood outside the school waiting for the SWAT team. Here you had, within a few minutes, 19 police officers outside a door, some of them taking fire. As we now know, Ramos was firing through the door and through the walls of the schoolroom at the officers outside. So they did go inside, but they didn't continue to rush into the room. Why didn't they figure out a way to breach in more quickly? That, I think, is a big question that many have asked today.
Pete, as you are talking, I want to pull back up this picture that is happening live right now, which is the Texas governor, Greg Abbott. He was at that news conference. We took some of that live here on this network, NBC News Now. He is now taking questions. And, Pete, he was just asked specifically about what we are discussing here, the investigation, what we heard from Texas DPS. And the governor says he is livid. He says he is livid and said that he was misled. It is not clear who he was misled by. We're going to work to turn around that soundbite and bring it to folks in a second here really quickly. But it is, you know, this is the governor of the state who was part of the public face and the public response to what happened in this town, in this community, and furious about this. Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that struck me about the way that they've handled this early on is they have the Texas Department of Public Safety, which, as you and I discussed earlier today, was not involved in going into the school. They have now been given the task of investigating what happened. But it did seem like in the first day or so, rather than being neutral investigators, they were trying to defend what happened without having all the facts. And perhaps now they're rethinking about whether that was the best approach.
Pete Williams, thank you for that. We are going to stay, obviously, on top of that Greg Abbott news conference. The governor, again, still speaking now. He is in Texas. Obviously, he's in that town. He is not actually at this NRA convention that is in Houston. He was supposed to appear there in person. Instead, he sent a pre-recorded, taped message. I want to listen in just for a second to what we're hearing from the governor. I'm not actually sure what question he's taking, but let's find out together.
Because as the governor was, I got the same information that the governor got until yesterday afternoon. I was blown away, and again this morning, other information. So I don't have an answer for you yet, but I can tell you if we need to make changes in that, we will.
Governor, you're asking if you're making mental health more available. Governor, we got one question. Come on. That's it? That's it. Unbelievable.
That was the end of the press conference there, the end of that news conference, and you heard from another official the anger, you know, referencing that they had just found out, he said this morning, yesterday, about some of these new details that have come out that were revealed by Texas DPS. Again, this is happening, right? As in Houston, some 300 miles away, you have the NRA Convention happening. Tens of thousands of gun advocates, gun supporters who are there. You also have tens of thousands of demonstrators outside bringing their message to the NRA doorstep for gun reform, gun changes. This is Beto O'Rourke, Democrat, of course, who's running to be governor. You just saw Greg Abbott. Here's Beto O'Rourke. He showed up at those demonstrations in Houston. And they are heated. There have been some confrontational moments. Inside the room, let's see if we can get a quick live picture from inside the room, too. You've got, I believe, Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who is either about to speak. He actually is speaking right now. He followed Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota the NRA head Wayne LaPierre, and then the headliner, of course, will be former President Donald Trump in just a couple of minutes. Ted Cruz, who you're seeing speak right now, he is really the highest profile Texas Republican who is appearing at this event after Governor Abbott bowed out for that news conference you just watched live, after the other Texas Senator, John Cornyn, canceled on the NRA because of a scheduling conflict. Same goes for Texas Congressman Dan Crenshaw. We have a concert this weekend for the NRA that some musicians were supposed to perform at. Lee Greenwood, Don McLean both pulled out, saying it would be disrespectful to perform. I want to bring in now some of the folks who are covering this for us. Shaq Brewster is live for us in Houston. He has been following these demonstrations. He has been following what's happening inside the room. And, you know, one of the things we heard from Governor Abbott just a moment ago, Shaq, was this focus on mental health. To the gun reform advocates who are outside the convention hall with you, that does not go nearly far enough, they say.
No. Not at all, Hallie. You know, one other thing that we heard in that pre-recorded message on the inside of this convention hall is you heard Governor Abbott say that there are hundreds of gun laws on the books, and that didn't stop this shooting. You got the sense that he is not looking for any new laws that would restrict guns, and that's exactly what people were expecting to hear outside. You see some of the protesters here. You probably heard that uproar just a couple of minutes ago. I just want you to see what's going on. We are directly across the street from the convention center. On this side is the convention center. That's where you have Ted Cruz speaking right now. That's where you have the speaker series and the big convention hall. You see police are in the middle of the street, and then on this side you have protesters, demonstrators. We saw thousands of them earlier today. That's where you heard Beto O'Rourke address them. And what you see, and there are moments where as people are coming out of the convention hall going to the parking center, they are confronted by some of the protesters. There are the gates there. Nothing has gotten physical from what I've seen, but you get that passion, the example of the passion that exists on both sides of this issue. I want you to listen to some of my conversations away from the confrontations, but from what people were saying about what got them here, what drew them to be so passionate and to make sure that they're protesting the NRA convention.
Picking up should feel shameful. People are completely ignorant to the fact that there are parents making funeral arrangements today.
How confident are you that something will change?
Not confident at all until things like the NRA go away.
And that last point that you heard there, Hallie, that is something that I'm hearing repeatedly. There's a lot of pessimism here. People know the legislative realities of any action in Washington, D.C., but that's not stopping them from coming here, and that's part of the point. They want an assault weapons ban. That is something you hear specifically from protesters. They want universal background checks. They want that to be expanded. They are not optimistic about getting that, but that they see this as so important that they're going to come here and they're going to continue to demonstrate, and they say bring those demonstrations to the ballot box in November, Hallie.
Take us inside the hall for a second, Shaq, because there are convention attendees, and as you know, I was in Houston overnight this morning, flew back to Washington today, who have said things to our team like they believe that this should still go on, that what happened in Uvalde is not necessarily going to change the opinions of people inside. I also want to explain to people the reason why you're outside, we try to pull back the curtain a little bit here on this show, is because the speakers are talking. Former President Trump's about to take the stage, and you're not actually supposed to be doing live shots, right? That close to the stage where it's all set up as the former president is speaking. That is why you are here. We have a team inside the room, but I didn't want people to think, why isn't Shaq in the hall? We would get you in there. We're sort of logistically doing this here. Anyways, take us inside the room. What you're hearing from attendees and some of the expectation there.
No, really good point that you make. We have a correspondent and producer team inside the hall where these speeches are taking place. That's how we're getting the notes from the outside. But yes, I'm outside covering the demonstrations and talking attendees as they were going in and out. And the point that you made was really important. You had people who said, yes, they care about this issue. People who are attending the NRA convention saying that they were heartbroken by the images that we saw earlier this week. But they say they also value that Second Amendment. And one thing that you get is some nuance. While some attendees may agree, yeah, there should be more background checks, or maybe we should look at things a little bit more closely, there's a fear there in their eyes that will slip into more restrictions on them, that possible raising the age, for example, on people who can have assault weapons from 18 to 21, that's a proposal you hear from folks here, that could lead into confiscating guns in a widespread way. So there's that sensitivity there, and there's that fear there, even from people who are attending the convention who want to do something and who are heartbroken as many of the people you see behind me are.
Shaq Brewster, thank you. I'm going to ask you to stay close to your camera because Shows. We may be coming back to you in a little bit later on in the show. But I want to bring in our Kristen Welker, because we are waiting to hear from former President Trump, who is, of course, headlining this convention. Our chief White House correspondent is joining us now. And Kristen, we're going to talk about a lot in this conversation here, and I want to be really clear with people that when the arguably most powerful Republican in the country comes and speaks 3 days after a horrific massacre that has captured the nation with these new calls for gun reform, the tone, I think, that that person sets matters for the discussion of what could realistically happen as it relates to gun reform, gun control legislation, changes to the nation's gun laws. We have you obtain these excerpts of what the former president is expected to say. Does it signal to you like perhaps he may call for changes to the nation's gun laws, or no?
Well, I spoke to an aide close to the former president, Hallie. I asked that question specifically. Is he going to call for new gun restrictions, new gun laws? This aide said, tune in. What I can tell you is that he leans into funding mental health. He leans into securing schools. Let me just read you a few of the excerpts that we got, Hallie. He starts off, you talk about tone, and I think that's a really important point. He starts off by saying each precious young soul that was taken is an incomprehensible loss, stolen from us by a malice that no words can describe. That's how these excerpts start. While we don't know enough about this week's killing, we know there are many things we must do. We need to drastically change our approach to mental health. There are always so many warning signs. Almost all of these disfigured minds share the same profile. He goes on to say teachers, parents, school officials, and community members need to be recognizing and addressing these alarm bells promptly and aggressively, and our school discipline systems, instead of making excuses and continually turning a blind eye, need to confront bad behavior head on. And then this, I think, is where my eye goes to. He calls for bipartisanship. All of us must unite, Republican and Democrat, in every state and at every level of government to finally harden our schools and protect our children. What we need now is a top-to-bottom security overhaul at schools across this country. He goes on to calling for arming law-abiding citizens so that they can protect themselves. So nothing in that suggests that he's going to call for new gun restrictions, Hallie, but I do think the tone is significant. Now, look, of course there is bipartisan support for funding mental health services. Right. That's something I think a lot of people can agree on, but it gets much tougher when you look at things like expanding background checks, when you look at things like increasing the age that you can obtain one of these assault weapons. We know that those are among the things that a bipartisan group of senators are discussing while they are on their memorial recess for the next 10 days. The question is, will they be able to find common ground? By the way, one of the other things that they're discussing is trying to secure schools, Hallie. Will they come up with a new set of proposals? It sounds like former President Trump is going to endorse that idea. But when it comes to those specific things like expanded background checks, according to these excerpts, not in these excerpts, but of course you and I are going to be listening very closely to see what he actually says.
I would think it's also fair to note, Kristen, you have watched as many of the former president's speeches as I have, and this is oftentimes somebody who does not stick to the script and does not always stick to the prepared excerpts, and so we will be seeing that. One thing I do want to also point out to folks for context here is back in 2018 and 2019, after Parkland, after I think it was the shooting in El Paso, Texas, after the shooting in the Walmart parking lot, the former President Trump at the time openly mused about the possibility of changing age limits, for example, for access to some firearms, for, as you mentioned, background checks, red flag laws, et cetera. Had conversations with the NRA that you and I covered at the time at the White House about what could be done, et cetera. How closely do we think Republican Party leaders are going to be listening to the tone that Donald Trump sets today?
Very closely. Look, you and I covered all 4 years of the Trump administration. I think you and I can agree there were a number of extraordinary days, but that was one of them when he met here with a bipartisan group of lawmakers, sat next to Senator Dianne Feinstein, and expressed an openness and willingness to support new gun legislation, including expanded background checks, a measure that failed in the wake of the Sandy Hook massacre. And so for a brief moment, Hallie, you and I and all of the reporters who were covering that moment were reporting on the fact that could this perhaps be the moment where something changes when it comes to gun legislation in America. And there were a number of bipartisan discussions. There was some optimism on Capitol Hill that might actually happen. We know that then he met with leaders of the NRA. He met with some of his aides here within the West Wing at the time, and then he seemed to back down from that position. But it was so extraordinary, and it seemed at that moment like perhaps they were almost closer to getting something done than in the wake of Sandy Hook, because you had this bipartisan support and leadership from a Republican president saying, yes, let's do something different. So I think that when you talk about the tone, when you talk about the messaging, this comes at a critical time because you have this bipartisan group of senators who are meeting right now. Now, Senator Chris Murphy has said, look, he has often felt as though he's been Charlie Browned in these instances. Basically, his way of saying he's not getting his hopes up, because it is so difficult.
The football
once
never
you
stays
start
where you think it's going to stay. Right.
Exactly. And because it is so difficult to find common ground on these issues, because when you go into individual districts, that is when you realize how complicated this is for lawmakers, when some of their supporters say, I wouldn't vote for this person if they change their stance on gun legislation. And so that's where the complication comes from. But this is certainly, I think, a speech that a number of Republicans and Democrats are going to be listening to quite closely. And the tone, Hallie, the tone is going to be critical.
You know, and I do wonder if he'll mention the fact that under his administration, he did sign an executive order banning bump stocks in the wake of the Las Vegas shooting, for example, one tangible thing. Kristen Welker, thank you. Also, I'm going to ask you to stay close to a camera. I appreciate it. I appreciate you being with us for the next little bit. Let's take a minute to talk about the way that the people in Uvalde have had to deal with all of this, right? Bring it back to those folks, to those victims we've been telling you about night after night, those kids, the many people who lost the ones they loved the most, their families, their friends, their people they loved. And the news now, as we found out today, about the mistakes that were made in the law enforcement response to this shooting. We just heard Governor Abbott, I should say, get really angry. I told you what he said, and I want you to watch what he said.
Yes, I was misled. I am livid about what happened. The information that I was given turned out in part to be inaccurate, and I'm absolutely livid about that.
Keep in mind that Uvalde is a city with a really shared sense of community. And you can see it, people putting their arms around each other, people trying to be there for each other in this unimaginably, incomprehensibly difficult moment. But that feeling of community that's carried through generations is now giving itself into something else, this shared sense of grief, these questions over what happened, because that fourth grade classroom is now joining the list you're about to see. This is a very, very, very long list of school shootings that have happened in this country since 1999. These are instances where guns were fired on or very near some of these schools. It's a lot. It's a lot of names. It's a lot of people. And that's the backdrop to what we're seeing in Uvalde. That's the backdrop to the grief that this community is feeling. While some of these shootings did not turn deadly, many did. There have been more than 500 students and teachers who have been killed or hurt in mass shootings in this country, from Columbine to Virginia Tech to Sandy Hook to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And now Robb Elementary School has the unfortunate distinction of being added to that list. Yasmin Vasugian joins me now. Yasmin, you and I were on TV on a different network a couple minutes ago, and I referenced this, where you spoke with the brother live on the air of this amazing little boy, Xavier Lopez, who loved to dance cumbia. And his brother's girlfriend, his aunt, basically was saying that he was her dancing partner. They are mad. They're mad about what happened.
They're angry. This entire town is angry. The state is angry. People that I've been speaking to across the board, the country is angry. But they specifically, I mean, you heard the description of Xavier, Hallie, as I was interviewing them. This 10-year-old little boy, you know, he was with his girlfriend. He said his brother saying that he took care of his little girlfriend, and I bet he picked it up from his big brother, because his big brother seemed very much in love with his own girlfriend, and they have their little baby together. And he said he gave everything to his little girlfriend and gave her money and gave her whatever it is that he got, and shared his time with her as a little 10-year-old boy. Annabelle, who also lost her life. And I asked what classroom they were in, and they were in classroom 111. And we know now, after the press conference today, it was classroom 111 and 112. that were the targets of this shooter. And the students were trapped inside those classrooms. And now Xavier's family, and I'm sure Annabelle's family, though I haven't had the opportunity to speak to them, they are crushed forever because of the loss of that little boy and the huge future he had ahead of him, and the part that he played in their family. I'll let them tell you themselves, and then we'll talk on the other side.
What did he like to dance to?
He liked to dance to cumbia. He was my dancing partner.
He was your partner. Are you guys frustrated at all about the way the police handled this?
Very frustrated. Selfish.
What frustrates you the most?
That
they didn't do anything.
And that is what I'm hearing across the board, Hallie. Every single person that I have spoken to, especially after we learned about this timeline, right? While they cleared more things up today, that first 911 call coming in at 11:30, the first from inside the school coming at 12:03 from classroom 112, 8 to 9 kids we were told were alive at that point, a teacher as well. And then 47 minutes later, that shooter was neutralized. 47 minutes. 12:19, a 911 Hallie call came in from room 111. That is where Xavier sat. That is where Xavier was in Annabelle, room 111. At 12:19, a 911 call came in from that room. That means people were alive. Maybe Xavier, maybe Annabelle, right? That is what his family is thinking today. That is what I'm sure her family is thinking today. And people are angry. Listen, I think that there is an inherent distrust with the police in this community already. And I'm learning that as I talk to people. That has become obvious to me. And they have certainly done themselves a major disservice because of the actions they took or failed to take that day, and the way in which they have communicated some of these actions. You and I both know, we've covered these things, we've been out in these press conferences. You don't hold a press conference unless you have accurate information. You don't hold a press conference unless you can answer the hard questions. 21 people are dead. People deserve answers. And you hold those press conferences when you can provide those answers. And that is not how they have carried out their obligation. Let me just say one more thing. As you mentioned, as you came to me earlier, the governor speaking a little bit earlier, angry about the misinformation, the things that he was led to believe, right? There is a reason why the governor does not give you a TikTok of a mass shooting on the same day of that shooting, right? We know those initial recounts of what took place are usually inaccurate. And we were all kind of curious as to why he would have done that on that day and provided those details. And so I think the hope is they find out the answers from the police, from this investigation, but the trust has already been lost. I'm not quite sure it's going to be regained again after all that has gone down.
Yasmin Vasukian, live for us in Uvalde. Yasmin, thank you for being there. Appreciate it. We're going to take a break. We're going to take a breath, and we'll be right back. It is the Friday night of a holiday weekend. Maybe you're watching me right now in your car, on your way to the beach, you're on a plane, somewhere fun, because boy, the Memorial Day weekend travel rush is happening right now. Something like 40 million of us are going to be traveling for the holiday. And it comes as the national average gas price today, $4.59 a gallon. It's not like flying is going to be cheaper for you. The average domestic round trip ticket this weekend is almost $400. Planes need fuel too, right? This is nearly a 30% jump from before the pandemic. Our Jesse Kirsch is joining us now from Chicago. And yet, Jesse, even with all the people on the roads and in the skies and how expensive it is, a lot of us are still making plans to get away for a minute.
Yeah, Hallie, we can't catch a break, can we? But people are holding their nose, making those plans anyway. And there's this sentiment amongst people that we've spoken with that after everything we've gone through over the last couple of years, they're willing to pay that extra money to go on a trip. Here's what some people told us at the airport earlier. What did it feel like to book a flight this weekend?
It kind of hurt. I just closed my eyes and let Jasmine take the wheel.
I didn't like the price at all. I was not thrilled when I saw the cost.
So even though it costs a little bit more, it's not going to stop you?
Not this time, but maybe the next one.
not this time, but maybe other times for some people. And I will say, Hallie, there are people out there who are staying home because of the economic conditions we're facing right now.
Yeah.
There was a woman at a gas station yesterday who I asked about traveling this weekend. She said, she looked at me like I was crazy. She goes, no, because of the gas prices. So that is stopping some people. But you can see behind me, plenty of people are still taking to the skies this weekend.
Yeah, that's for sure. Is the pandemic at all a factor in the folks that you're talking to? You know, a lot of people might be vaccinated. Are you seeing a lot of masks? I was just at the airport this morning flying back from Houston, and it was pretty much a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just, do a straw poll here looking around. I'd say that most people are not wearing masks here at O'Hare Airport in Chicago. So, I think at this point, many people are flying as if it's normal again. Obviously, we fly a lot for our jobs. I've spent a lot of time in airports, on planes in recent weeks. And I'd say the majority of people on planes I've been on recently are not wearing masks. I think for a lot of people, they're ready to do something again, even though, of course, we continue to remind people there is still that risk of COVID out there. But as you mentioned, a lot of people are vaccinated and, do what you can to take those precautions.
Jesse Kirsch, good to see you. Thanks so much. So some developing news tonight on something totally different, and that is jury deliberations in this Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. They are going to pick back up on Tuesday. They got handed the case earlier today after closing arguments. They're going to be considering Heard's countersuit against Depp, along with Depp's suit against Heard for defamation. So here's what you either missed if you weren't watching it here live. We'll catch you up. Lawyers for Johnny Depp started closing arguments, saying Heard took on what they called the role of a lifetime during the trial. Watch.
There is an abuser in this courtroom, but it is not Mr. Depp. Either he hit her countless times, or you can't believe a single word that comes out of her mouth. What you have in the end is Ms. Heard's word. Do you trust it?
Heard's lawyers, for their part, asked the jury to think about the message that Depp and his attorneys are trying to send to Heard, to, in their words, every victim of domestic abuse.
They want to penalize Ms. Heard for not speaking about that earlier. That's ridiculous, and it's insulting, and it's just victim blaming at its most disgusting. Hold Mr. Depp accountable for his actions.
Over the past 6 weeks, the jury has watched the actors' friends, staff, therapists on the stand. They've seen recordings of their fights from the former couple, texts about their relationship. They've seen emotional testimony. They've heard from Depp and Heard themselves. Steve Patterson has watched this trial. He's watched all of it. He joins me now. He is live in Fairfax, Virginia, where this courthouse is. We talked about how high profile of a trial this has been. There is now this sort of break in the action, right? Because you had closing arguments. The jury got their instructions. They're deliberating. They're going to come back on Tuesday to continue to deliberate. What's at stake here?
Look, a lot is at stake, and I have to say that you may see people filtering out behind me. This is how worked up the crowd is outside of the courtroom.
They're still there?
So many Depp supporters. They're still here, and you may hear screaming in back of me, and that is not because they see Johnny Depp or Amber Heard. That may be for the legal team that is coming out. That's how fervent in support for Johnny Depp a lot of these people are. When I was there in the crowd as Johnny Depp was leaving, it felt like I was at one of his movie premieres. That's how worked up the crowd was. A lot at stake here, obviously, millions of dollars. Goes without saying, the jury can kind of on a sliding scale decide how much each party gets, if each party gets anything, because remember, they're deciding essentially two verdicts, the suit and the countersuit. So a lot there, a lot to work through. Our legal experts that we just spoke to basically tell me that this is not going to be something that comes back right away. Obviously, they took a break for the night. They're done for the weekend. They're done for the holiday. They'll come back Tuesday. It may not be until Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, maybe even on into the next week until we have a verdict on this, Hallie.
They're trying to, the attorneys are both trying to frame this in very different ways, obviously. And one lawyer for Amber Heard told the jury if Depp was abusive toward her even just one time, then she wins. Right? Her team brought up a lot of the evidence we saw over the course of the trial in their closing arguments. Talk a little bit about what we heard and saw from them.
Well, so that is the defense of absolute truth, which essentially says that, Depp is alleging that Heard was trying to defame him in that op-ed, that the defamation came from the fact that he was establishing Depp as this abuser, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental abuse, whatever, abuser. So in saying that Heard is wrong about that, all Heard's team says they have to prove is that there was one instance of abuse. And then you have to define the parameters of what that abuse constitutes. They're saying it's not just physical abuse. It's not just sexual abuse. It can be emotional abuse. It can be financial abuse from the power dynamic in the relationship. Beyond that, you and I have talked a lot about the burden of proof. It lands squarely on Johnny Depp. He's the plaintiff in this case. He has to prove, essentially that article was to defame him. That article was about him, that she wrote that lying, knowing that what she was saying was wrong, and doing it maliciously with actual malice to try to destroy his reputation. That is a lot of barriers to work through. So they work to establish that in quite a few ways, and primarily establishing that absolute truth, but also framing it around the conversation about domestic violence, because I think that is the frame narrative of this entire case. It will have the most ripple effects outside of the case, obviously, Hallie.
Steve Patterson, live for us there outside the courthouse in Fairfax. I'm sure we'll see you back there Tuesday, Steve. Thank you. Appreciate it. If you or somebody you know, by the way, is dealing with abuse at home, there are resources, there are people and places to help. Visit thehotline.org or call 1-800-799-7233. Let's get you over now to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the Department of Justice is again not bringing charges, it says, against former FBI agents on the Larry Nassar case. Remember, 2 former agents were accused of failing to properly investigate these claims from gymnasts that the USA Gymnastics doctor, Dr. Nassar, abused them. Nassar is currently serving up to 175 years in prison. Number 2, for the first time, a California parole panel recommended that Patricia Krenwinkel be released. She was one of cult leader Charles Manson's followers. She's been denied parole 14 times for the killing of pregnant actor Sharon Tate and 4 others back in the 60s. The state parole board's legal division is going to review this recommendation before it probably goes to Governor Gavin Newsom. That's definitely one we'll be watching. Number 3, a jury found 2 men accused in Stone Foltz' hazing death not guilty on 2 counts. The fraternity brothers were found not guilty of involuntary manslaughter and reckless homicide, but they were found guilty of hazing. Foltz died last year of alcohol intoxication when he was a sophomore at Bowling Green State University. Number 4, the number of homes for sale is going up. Realtor.com says it's up just 9% last week alone. Why? A lot of sellers are looking at this red hot market. They're seeing the price of their house. Maybe they're hitting up Zillow and going, well, I better get in on this now. Sales are slowing down a little bit because mortgage rates have gone up, as you probably know, since the start of the year. Number 5, Japan getting ready to welcome tourists back next month after 2 years of restrictions because of the pandemic. The country is reopening its border to foreign visitors, but only for package tours right now. If you're trying to go by yourself, solo, with your family, still got to wait a little longer. When we come back, Russia says it's gaining ground in Ukraine, but U.S. officials say the Kremlin's also facing some pretty serious losses. We're going to have the latest from our correspondent on the ground in Kyiv next. I want to take you to Ukraine now, because today you've got Russian troops getting more territory in the eastern part of Ukraine, but it's coming at a price. Some pretty big losses along the way. Officials on both sides saying they've just captured Lyman, a small Ukrainian city in the east. But the U.S. says Ukraine has destroyed 1,000 Russian tanks, along with dozens of aircraft, helicopters, hundreds of pieces of artillery, right? So they're getting more ground. It is coming at a price. Russia's still pushing, and it's not just in the east either. In Dnipro, a more central Ukrainian city, an official is saying at least 10 people have been killed and 30 more were hurt in shelling earlier this morning. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, warning that at this point, he thinks Russia is trying to turn cities and towns in Ukraine to literal ashes. Cal Perry is joining us now live from Kyiv. And Cal, we're getting a little bit more insight into the scale of losses on the Russian side, but it is clearly not stopping them in their tracks.
No, it seems like they're willing to pay this heavy price for, again, territory in the east. The war, we should remind our viewers, has been raging in the eastern part of the country now for 8 years. But this phase 2, as Russia has called it, seems to be a focus on the eastern part of the country in the Donbass region. And what we have seen in the last 24 to 48 hours is slow, methodical progress that has officials here worried that this reinforced Russian line that is, quote unquote, shelling up and down the line on the east of these Ukrainian towns sanctions is starting to now bear fruit, that this phase 2 is starting to now bear fruit, and that Russia is starting to gain some momentum in this part of the country, which we should say in the northern part of the country, it is the Ukrainian military that is still on the move, by and large, in towns in and around the region of Kharkiv. But again, in the eastern part of the country, it is this slow, methodical progress that has officials worried. It is what has them calling for more long-range rockets from the United States, a call that you're going to hear only increasing, I think, over the weekend, Hallie.
President Zelensky has repeatedly accused Russia of genocide. We now have this new report out today from international scholars basically saying, yes, that is exactly what is happening in Ukraine. What is the pragmatic impact of a report like that, Cal?
Well, look, the report is supposed to hold countries accountable who have signed the Geneva Convention and the Convention Against Genocide. And what the report does is it lays out a case against Russia, and it lays out a particular case, including the propaganda that Russia has used in its own setting up for this genocide. So it talks about the propaganda on Russian TV. It talks about what they're doing in these towns and in these cities. It talks about the relocation of Ukrainian citizens who are being moved forcibly, if you listen to Ukrainian government officials, into Russia. When you put all of that together, it paints a picture of Russia carrying out acts of genocide here in Ukraine. And look, when you look at what we know has happened on the ground in places like Mariupol, what is happening in the eastern part of the country, where these cities are literally being bombed into rubble, and then the rubble is being bombed, it is all part of what we have seen in the past from Russia, specifically what they did in Syria. So the report is supposed to be a wake-up call for nations around the world. Certainly for the NATO members, it won't be a surprise, but it is something here, certainly, that officials are pointing to as further evidence of why it is, they say, the international community needs to step in a serious way, Hallie.
Cal Perry, live for us in Kyiv. Cal, I'm glad you're with us. Thank you for being there. Coming up here on the show, Southern Baptist leaders releasing a once secret list of pastors and church workers accused of sexual abuse. We're going to talk more about what we're learning about this 205-page document. And we're also going to talk about what made Massachusetts lawmakers pardon the very last so-called Salem witch. That's in the local. Stay with us. So this next story may be tough to hear, but leaders in the Southern Baptist Church think it's important for you to hear it. That's why they're sharing it, this 205-page list that had been compiled in secret with names of hundreds of pastors and church workers who have been accused of rape, of molestation, child pornography. In a statement on the Southern Baptist Church's website, the leaders say, in part, they hope the survivors of these heinous acts find hope and healing, and the churches will use the list to protect others. They decided to release this thing after an independent firm called Guidepost Solution put out its own findings of past abuse claims inside the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention. That report said the former vice president and general counsel of the committee and the former spokesperson had kept this private list of allegations, and that the SBC's executive committee had mishandled those claims. They'd stonewalled survivors, this report says. By the way, both of those executives could not be reached for comment today. Ann Thompson is joining us now with more. And Ann, you know, it is a public list. It obviously difficult and sensitive. What have you found as you've looked through this?
Well, first of all, Hallie, the SBC was forced to make this list public, essentially. The reason the Guidepost investigation existed at all was because survivors pushed for it. And for years, they had, you know, the SBC had done essentially what the Catholic Church had done and tried to stonewall survivors and tried to deny the existence of any problem. And we find out during the Guidepost investigation that there was a list, more than 700 names on that list, 400 of them associated with the Southern Baptist Convention. And I think much like what we saw in the Catholic Church, you see here in the Southern Baptist Convention, this abuse of power and faith, and in particular, people, ministers, going from church to church and crossing state lines. Let me give you an example. There was a man in South Carolina who was accused of sexually assaulting a 16-year-old. He pled guilty to a lesser charge. His sentence was wiped clean. He left South Carolina and went to Arkansas. Another man was accused of abusing children in Colorado. He left Colorado, went to Kentucky, joined a church in Kentucky, and continued to abuse there. It is a vile list. It is very difficult to read, but it is what everyone hopes is the first step to healing and, most importantly, reform.
Before this list was released, you spoke with one victim, and she talked with you about reporting abuse. I want to play that.
I was met with, well, you're an enemy of God. It was threats, harassments. I had to move from my home.
what is this list being put out mean to them?
To the victims, for Hannah Kate Williams, I mean, the whole investigation, the report from Guidepost and this list is a sense of vindication, because it says, you know what, even though we vilified you, even though we ostracized you, we now believe you. And the church leadership hopes that this will start to be a bridge between survivors and the church. But more than the list, what survivors want to see is action. They want to see, is the church going to do the things that need to be done to prevent sexual abuse, and then properly deal with survivors when they come forward and say, hey, somebody did something wrong to me, especially young children. Hallie?
Ann Thompson. And before I let you go, what's next for the SBC then? Do we know what the next steps would be here?
The next step is their annual meeting is in Anaheim in June, June 12th through the 15th. So that's the next big marker.
Ann Thompson, thank you so much. Appreciate you being with us. Thank you for that. Former President Donald Trump has just stepped onto the stage at the NRA's annual convention in Houston, as we told you about earlier in the show. To be transparent, listen, there's always a discussion about taking speeches live and what we decide to show you here and what you'll see. You could watch this online. You're going to watch it here on streaming for a little bit. Again, this is a former president, who, as Kristen Welker had reported earlier, biggest name in the Republican Party right now, and there's a real focus on policy making. I want to listen in for just a couple of minutes, see if there's any news for just a second.
Our sacred liberties as Americans, and together we're going to be standing strong and tall for many, many years to come. And I really do appreciate this incredible turnout. I want to express my tremendous gratitude to each and every one of the proud citizens here today. You are the backbone of our movement, and you are the backbone of our country. You know that. I just heard him. He made a wonderful speech. Ted Cruz, Senator, where are you? Thank you very much. Ted, thank you very much. Great job. Governor Kristi Noem is here. Kristi, thank you. Kristi. Doing a fantastic job. In North Carolina, there's a hot politician. He's a hot politician. Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. I don't know where you are, Mark. I don't know where Mark is, but he is fantastic. We just had a very good day, as you know, in North Carolina. As we gathered this week, citizens across this state and across this nation are filled with grief in the wake of the heinous massacre of Robb Elementary School in Uvalde. You know all about that, and what a horrible, horrible thing it was to see it, to watch it, to hear about it. The terrible murder of 19 innocent children and 2 adult teachers, with many badly injured, was a savage and barbaric atrocity that shocks the conscience of every single American. So horrible. I want to ask for a brief moment of silence as I read the names of these beautiful people, all young, wonderful lives ahead of them. They're brave teachers whose lives were destroyed by an out-of-control lunatic. So we'll start. Alexandria Rubio. Alitha Ramirez. Amory Garza. Annabelle Guadalupe Rodriguez. Eliana Cruz Torres. Ellie Garcia. Jacqueline Cazares. Jayla Nicole Silguro. Jace Lovarnos. Jose Flores. Leila Salazar. McKenna Lee Elrod. Maitai Rodriguez, Miranda Mathis, Nevaeh Bravo, Rogelio Torres, Tess Marie Mata, Ozia Garcia, Javier Lopez, two great and beautiful, brilliant teachers, Eva Morales, Irma Garcia. And thank you very much. It's a beautiful moment of silence for something that should never have even been thought about, let alone happened. Each precious young soul that was taken is an incomprehensible loss, literally not comprehensible, stolen from us by a malice that no words can describe, sickness. The monster who committed this crime is pure evil, pure cruelty, pure hatred, absolute pure hatred. And while those he slaughtered are now with God in heaven, he will be eternally damned to burn in the fires of hell. As we mourn for so many beautiful victims, I know that everyone here joins me in praying for the families who are suddenly missing the brightest light in their lives. We see their agony. We ask God to ease their suffering and to heal their pain, and together we grieve side by side as one great American family. Now is the time to find common ground. Sadly, before the sun had even set on the horrible day of tragedy, we witnessed a now familiar parade of cynical politicians seeking to exploit the tears of sobbing families to increase their own power and take away our constitutional rights. Every time a disturbed or demented person commits such a hideous crime, there's always a grotesque effort by some in our society to use the suffering of others to advance their own extreme political agenda.
You have
Even
been
more
listening to
repulsive
former
is
President Trump speak at the NRA Convention in Houston, beginning his remarks with a moment of silence and the reading of the names of those 19 children and 2 teachers slaughtered in a massacre in Uvalde, Texas, some 300 miles from Houston, where this convention center is. The former president describing that loss as incomprehensible, a horrific mass shooting, before then pivoting to what he describes as the political piece of it. Gun reform advocates have gathered outside the convention center in Houston to make the point, in their view, that now is the time for change, if not now, when, to change the nation's gun laws. Let me bring in Kristen Welker, who's been listening in as well. And Kristen, the question for the former president is, will he call for support, for example, for some of those bipartisan talks that we've seen on Capitol Hill between Democrats and Republicans for some kind of change to the nation's gun laws to try to stop something like mass shootings at schools or grocery stores or wherever from happening again?
That's going to be the big question, Hallie, and based on the excerpts that we have seen so far, nowhere in those excerpts does he call for gun reform. You and I started earlier in the hour talking about tone, and former President Trump started with a very solemn, very serious tone, reading out the names of the victims, those precious lives that were lost. We do know that he is going to call for Republicans and Democrats to come together to work on this, to put more resources into things like mental health and securing schools, things that have a lot of bipartisan support. But the tough stuff is when it comes to gun reform. That bipartisan call is notable because here you have him slamming what he called cynical politicians. Right. So already turning to the politics of it. And we know also, based on the excerpts, he's going to call out some big city mayors by name and say that they are not doing enough to address the issue of violence in their cities. So a little bit of a juxtaposition there, Hallie, but all eyes on former President Trump right now and whether or not he does bolster those bipartisan talks. So far, he has not done that.
All eyes on the city of Uvalde, Texas. Kristen Welker, thank you. We'll be looking for more of your coverage tomorrow morning on the Today Show here on NBC as the community, the world, the country continues to mourn with those families of those children and those teachers. That does it for us this hour. It's been a tough week. I hope you get a chance to spend some time with your families, wherever you are this weekend. We'll see you right back here Monday, same time, same place.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.